Hello and welcome to Khyber Shards, a 5th edition actual play show set in the Eberron campaign world. It's Friday, so we've got a KSA, and since we're only at 2 players right now, I'm taking a solo one to talk about fairy stories and why I love them, as you can probably tell I do based on the amount of time that we have spent in the Feywild. So I wanted to talk about what I see as fun about fairy stories, and then apply that a little bit to RPGs. And then we have just a couple of questions that we'll look at from our listeners at the end. If you want to submit questions for Kyber Shards Answers, you can do so on our Discord, the link to which is below, along with all of our various social media. So, what do I love about fairy stories that I apply to the Fae? The main thing I love about fairy stories is the strangeness and wonder of going into a world that is like, but not like ours. I love the escape of that. I love escaping to a world where magic is real, where fantasy exists, and where the world operates on a different set of rules, and maybe sometimes one that we might wish that our world operated on. It's the same reason people like fantasy literature. It's the same reason a lot of us play D&D after all. Uh, the fullest expression of my love of fairy stories is elucidated by J.R.R. Tolkien, unsurprisingly, if you know me at all. In his big long essay called On Fairy Stories, Tolkien offers his view on what the value of fairy stories is. And I really like this breakdown of it. It really applies to what I love about fairy stories. So that's kind of where I'm drawing the structure of this. So the first value of fairy stories, the first good thing about fairy stories is fantasy. This is the act of imagining and creating. We play D&D because we enjoy playing make believe with each other. And this is good and healthy for us, even though it sometimes, for a long time, got kind of mocked as not worthy of a grown up. It's not a childish activity; it's a fundamental part of who we are, and it's good for us. And so, using it in D&D kind of creates this meta fantasy where now I get to play in a world that doesn't really need to be grounded in reality of our physical nature the way that your main setting for a D&D setting usually is kind of grounded. The next great thing is the restoration of wonder. We get so used to the world that we stop seeing things as amazing like we did when we were kids. You think about the way you thought how cool animals were when you were a kid, whatever the animal you were into, whether you were into bugs or birds or sharks or wolves or whatever. Um, how explosively awesome those things were to you. Playing in the Feywild and playing in fairy stories lets us restore that by taking things that we recognize and moving them into a setting where they seem strange to us. We're restoring the strangeness and the wonder of this. So we're all probably familiar with a forest, but when we take it to a fantasy forest, to a fey forest, and now the animals can talk and the trees can move around of their own will and the colors and shapes are all different. Suddenly, it's not just a forest anymore. Suddenly, it is a new and strange and highly unpredictable setting where our characters can play around. Uh, the third great thing about fairy stories is escape. This is one of the things we love about D&D. The world is not always a great place. Sometimes it downright sucks. And isn't it amazing to be able to sit down with our friends and escape into a world that operates on a different set of rules, that maybe doesn't have some of the things that we dislike about our world or that are hard about our world? Or at least if it does have those things, we can do something about it because we're the heroes of the world. It's an opportunity to escape and be in a different world, in a different body for a time. And we can do that on a meta level in using the Feywild in a D&D setting or any other RPG setting, because oftentimes we build realistic, in a sense, worlds and that still have the same kinds of injustices and problems. And so escaping from whatever's going on in your campaign and taking a jaunt out into the Feywild, even if your story is not mainly about the Feywild, can be a big relief to your players. And it can also be just a nice change of pace for you as a DM. And lastly, according to Tolkien, the fourth great thing about fairy stories is consolation. This is a spiritual idea for Tolkien in that fairy stories can give us hope because in most of the beloved fairy stories, the tale becomes darker and darker and darker until finally, at the last desperate moment, hope breaks in and good has the opportunity to triumph. Now, not all fairy stories are like this. Obviously, the Brothers Grimm often made fairy stories very, very dark and had characters come to bad ends because they were trying to teach lessons about obeying your parents for the most part. um, but in a lot of the fantasy stories that we read, uh, we we see the heroes get into darker and darker places until finally there's the last moment, at the last possible moment, hope breaks in and we're able to save the day. The cool thing about this in an RPG is that we can allow our heroes to experience this and our players to experience it by proxy. But even more often, we allow our heroes to become an agent of this hope. Our heroes get to be the ones who arrive at the last desperate moment to save the day or not, because most TTRPGs don't just operate on what the characters wish would happen. They usually have chance of failure that adds stakes to it. So, how would I apply those four things: fantasy, restoration, escape, and consolation to an RPG? Uh, well, the restoration of wonder is a really easy one to use in the Feywild because the Feywild is usually described in a very naturalistic way, but we can take that, the familiar trees and flowers and plants and animals, and change them. We can change their size and shape. We can change their color, make them talk with strange voices. And just doing little things like that, even if they never talk, going into a fairy forest and the trees are a richer green and they have vibrant blue veins in the leaves and the bark of the trees is tinged to an almost crimson or almost pink or almost blue, whatever hue you want, or the bark isn't the sort of gray white that we sometimes describe as silver but actually silver or flecked with gold. We can take something as simple as a tree, and by giving it a different description, we restore the strangeness and the wonder of our players and give them the feeling of exploring a brand new world instead of just another forest where there happen to be some fantasy creatures living. Uh, Another great way to do this, especially in a TTRPG like D&D, is you can take spells that your players cast and you can change what they look like. I mean, usually we want to let the players describe their spells, but this time when you cast Burning Hands, instead of a sheet of flame coming out, a massive spray of flower petals bursts from your hands. It still has the same effect. It still damages the enemy. The flower petals, burst in sparks when they make contact with the enemy, but it looks different. It tells them you're in a place where magic operates a little bit differently. And there are some spells in D&D that are very, very fey oriented, fairy, fire, illusion spells, that kind of thing, that can be described in ways that mimic the environment that you've put them in. And if you're playing with the idea of um, domains of delight that D&D has currently been using for its description of the Feywild in 5th edition, then you could have the way things look in each domain change because each domain can kind of be this different kind of genre of storytelling. Is kind of the way I have tended to do it. Is different domains and different archfey are kind of genre like, and so what a spell looks like in one archfey's domain might be different from how it looks in another archfey's domain. So you can change that. You can make your characters and their gear change and look different. Although usually, I would say without taking away their abilities. Although sometimes you could even, and I've kind of thought this would be a really cool idea. I've never actually implemented it, so I'm not 100% sure on how it would work. But I think it would be a really cool idea to even when you go into a Fey domain, you pull out pre-prepared character sheets from an entirely different system and hand them over. It would need to be a simple system, and you'd have needed to make the characters ahead of time so you can have the surprise of it. But oh, look, tonight the rules of this world are entirely different, so different that while your character is fundamentally the same person, the things they can do have been changed, and you hand over the character sheets and you play in a different system. It's a great way to test out another system that your players have thought was interesting or that you thought was interesting, and a good way to do a one shot while still staying within the broader narrative of your campaign if you've got an ongoing campaign. This is a great concept, I think. I've never implemented it with the Feywild, although if you've been watching, you remember our Hero Kids one, we implemented a different system for our Rebel War in Gang One Shot using Hero Kids. And I think that went really well, and I think fitting your narrative mechanics to the genre is a really cool notion that could play very well in the Feywild. Uh, Now, in your Feywild, I think there needs to be different tones as we look at escaping from the world and changing. There should be places in the Feywild that are dark and scary, especially if you like the kind of grim, dark fairy stories that that the Brothers Grimm do, and that other dark fantasy settings make use of. But I think in your Feywild, there should also be a place for whimsy and silliness. Sometimes going into the Feywild should be a break, should be a breath of levity into your story, even if it's still dangerous, even if the stakes are still high. The tone can be very, very light, and whatever you do, it should still feel strange. The what it feels like shouldn't be, oh, I've walked into a village marketplace and this village marketplace works exactly like the village marketplace back home in our main setting. Instead, the village marketplace in this Fey domain uh, only uses, I don't know, fingernail clippings or eyelashes or acorns or whatever as a currency. Um, Fairy stories are also a great opportunity for your players to be heroic in a classical, even stereotypical way. Let your players be the heroes who ride to the rescue at the last minute. Let them be the woodsman who breaks in and saves Little Red Riding Hood from the big bad wolf in later versions of that story. Let them be Prince or Princess Charming who arrives to save the village from the dragon. Let them be whatever uh, as an option. Let them be the hero of the story in a way that maybe your main setting doesn't always let them, because your main setting is perhaps more grounded. A lot of settings are. The Feywild should be an opportunity for your players to be high fantasy romanticized heroes if that's what your players are looking for. But if it's not, I would still argue that the Feywild can be a place for them to act in a way that they wouldn't normally, or to play a role in a story that they wouldn't always get to. Now, that's most of them. I haven't covered fantasy, the act of making up stories. If you're feeling particularly bold, I think there's a really cool idea of having a Fey domain where the player characters can use skill checks to actually create and alter the world around them, where what they can imagine actually has an effect on the landscape and on the narrative and on what's available to them. Obviously, you could, I think, get a little out of hand with this, and it would require some trust for your players, but I think it's a really good concept and it fits really well in the Feywild. And depending on what your setting is, there are probably other planes where this fits, but I think the Feywild is one just because it's based so heavily, at least in my imagining, on storytelling. And so maybe if your bard is such an amazing storyteller that they can alter the nature of the Feywild around them. I think that's a really cool concept. I've never tried it, so I can't speak to exactly how it would play out with your table, but it's an idea I had while I was prepping for this video, and I think it's a really cool one, and I'd really love to see it implemented and try it out sometime. So those are sort of my thoughts on what I love about the Feywild and why I like setting things in the Feywild, and hopefully maybe some useful thoughts on how to use the Feywild in your campaign if you're thinking about taking a jaunt over into the Feywild. Before we go, we do have a question from Savage Artificer. Thalanis uses fairy tale logic, as you've demonstrated. What does fairy tale logic mean to you, and how do you incorporate it into your adventure planning for Fey adventures? I get the feeling that each archfey has an overarching theme to its story, which its subject stories are tied to. Does the archfey determine what the stories its subjects have to play out, or is it something the plane itself manifests based on each archfey? So the logic that the Feywild works on, for me, is dependent on what domain you're in. Archfey to me are kind of like genre archetypes. So a particular archfey might be this kind of fairy tale, or this kind of fairy tale, or even this style of fairy tale, like the Lord of Whimsy in our earlier in the campaign is obviously a particular style of storytelling more than a specific type of fairy tale, whereas the Forgotten Prince is much more a specific variety of stories, of fairy tale stories that would be his, as is the Forest Queen. Um, so for me, what the logic is going to be will somewhat be determined by what archfey you're dealing with and what domain you're dealing with. One thing I would say is, at least in my imagining of the Feywild, even though Archfey and most Fey are chaotic in alignment, they're bound by their nature. So the Forest Queen will always be about the defense of the natural world against the encroachment of artifice, of the artificial, of the urban, of the human in a lot of ways. That will always be a part of who she is. And so, as a patron, she might be very, very friendly as long as you're aligned with that. But if you're pushing back against the wild, then she's not. Um, so whether she's ally or enemy is very dependent on your view on the forest and on the city and how they interact. And there are lots of occasions where where the forest queen might be entirely unwilling to work with you, because you aren't willing to go all in on the forest. The wild is the best form, which is why in my imagining I don't give the forest queen a domain. I give her the Fey wild between the domains, the wood between each of the little domains in my imagining of the Feywild. The Feywild is this huge forest, and there are spaces inside the forest that are the domains of the various Fey themselves. Uh, to move into your second question, each Archfey has an overarching theme that they are bound to behave according to. As to their subject stories, I don't think the Archfey create their stories, and I don't think the Archfey determine the stories. I think in my Feywild, at least in most of the settings that I've run Fey adventures in my Feywild, the stories exist because they're stories that people tell. And so our material plane can manifest realities into the Feywild by the stories that we tell. And so each domain inside the Feywild is existing because of the kinds of stories that are told by mortals, which means that even the Archfey are not necessarily eternal. This is why I have archfey that are highly conceptual, because they're not tied to a specific story. They're tied to a whole archetypal concept of a story. So the Forgotten Prince is tied to stories of loneliness and loss, and the Forest Queen is tied to stories of wild versus civilized, of man versus nature, of that kind of thing. And so all of those stories, as they evolve and change and and fade out of existence and come into existence, would gravitate into the orbit of the appropriate archfey. So that's more how I look at it. So the plane itself manifests the story, but not specifically based on the archfey. It manifests the story, and then the appropriate archfey comes to govern that story. And sometimes an archfey might have only one or two stories. Sometimes an archfey might have a large domain with many lesser fey playing out lots of stories within them. So I would imagine that in the domain of the Forgotten Prince, you could get into all kinds of stories about loss and grief and loneliness. And in the Lord of Whimsy, you would get into all kinds of stories that are surrealistic and self-aware and that sort of thing. And in the Forest Queen's domain in the Feywild itself, you could find your way into all sorts of stories about the conflict between the civilized world and nature. This is kind of why I had the Green Knight as part of this and imagined a very old, pre-Arthurian form of the Green Knight, is because I wanted the Green Knight to seem like a fae attached to the Forest Queen, so that the story became about clashing with nature as a hero, or choosing not to, as the case may be. So that's how I would approach it. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, or if you got follow ups, stick them in the comments, and I will do my best to expand on that idea. That was our only question for today. I hope this video was useful to the GMs out there and interesting to those of you who have been watching Khyber Shards to get a little picture of how my mind works in terms of the Feywild. We'll continue our Feywild arc with Pog and Shade this coming Monday when the new episode drops, and we'll have more Khyber Shards answers coming up on future Fridays. And until next time, thanks for rolling with us.